Practice is the core of the Buddha's teaching.
How to practice well in a world where practice is a little diluted.
I can say that I'm a model of good practice, as I have problems of distraction, laziness myself. But too often people identify practice exclusively with practicing meditation. But I think we have to see that this is a very important question because there's a tendency now in contemporary Buddhism to regard the
Good morning, Venerable. Welcome back to Chung Huong Institute
good
podcast.
morning.
Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. I was really interested in having another interview with you because so many people these days, they really want to practice, it seems, but the mind is so scattered. And I think there are so
Yeah,
many options for practice, so many
yeah.
options for teachers these
Mm.
days. And I wondered if we can just kind of dive into your perspectives
Mm.
on how to practice well in a world that is kind of where practice is a little diluted.
Okay, I can say that I'm a model of good practice, as I have problems of distraction, laziness myself. But I would say certainly that practice is the core of the Buddha's teaching. But too often people identify practice exclusively with practicing meditation. But I think we have to see that, especially like in relation to lay people or householders, the Buddha doesn't place so much emphasis on intensive meditation. So I've come to see in the discourses that the Buddha gives to lay people, often he mentions five important, you could call these domains of practice. And we could see how these can imply or entail certain types of practices that one could undertake in daily life. So he says one of the important qualities for a lay follower or any follower is faith. And this means having faith and devotion towards the triple gem, the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. And this will translate in practical terms into engaging in maybe devotional practices. For example, reciting verses or texts in praise of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, participating in pujas, devotional rituals, making offerings, reciting sutras, and so forth. So that could be a valid means of practice. Okay, so that's faith. Another second quality the Buddha emphasizes as part of practice is sila, which means observing precepts and living in accordance with the precepts. And so, what I often recommend for any practitioner is this is a way of combining faith and sila, that every day they make it a point, at least once a day, to recite the three refuges and to recite the five precepts, and then to live in accordance with the precepts. Okay, a third domain of practice that the Buddha emphasizes for lay people is generosity, and that is the practice of giving, which has again, it has different aspects. So we could distinguish maybe three different types of giving or generosity, three fields of giving. One is giving as an expression of veneration, and this is giving when lay people make offerings and gifts to the monastic community as a way of supporting the monastic community and expressing their own veneration towards the monastics. Monastics representing a kind of embodiment of the Aryan Sangha, the community of noble ones. And then the second field of giving is called the field of compassion. And this is giving to the poor, the needy, giving to worthy charities, giving to support humanitarian organizations. And then the third field of giving is called the field of gratitude. So this will be giving gifts to those who have benefited one in your life. I think it would include providing support to one's parents, making offerings to one's teacher, and supporting other benefactors, anybody else who's benefited you in your life. Okay, so this is generosity or giving. Okay, and then So we can say that these three qualities or aspects of practice per pertain to developing one's character. So we have faith or devotion, sila, virtuous conduct, and generosity. So all of these help to develop a benevolent, spacious, compassionate character. The other two qualities are concerned with the development of understanding, wisdom, or insight. So the first of these is learning, which means becoming, for a Buddhist, becoming acquainted with the fundamental teachings of the Buddha through study of the texts. And then the fifth is, and one doesn't have to become a scholar of the texts, but I think for a Buddhist who wants to develop a clear understanding of the teaching, it's important to be able to turn to some of the fundamental discourses of the Buddha and some of the fundamental doctrinal structures, like the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, the three marks of existence, the distinction of wholesome and unwholesome qualities, karma and the fruits of karma. So one should have understanding of those principles. And then the fifth important aspect of practice is panya or wisdom. And the Buddha explains this as the insight into the arising and passing away of things. And so this, I would say, is the wisdom that develops through meditation. And it seems to be the wisdom, especially that develops through insight meditation.
Yeah, and a lot of people right now, since they're doing so many different kinds of meditations, right? They think they're doing like insight meditation, but then they're I don't know all the names of every tradition of meditation, of the meditations in every tradition, but I hear this a lot. And I'm curious, is there a danger, Venerable, of practicing so many within so many different, forms? And I feel myself in the past, I would get very distracted if I practiced like 5 different meditations in one day.
Okay, I think in my own experience, it's been important to have a number of different methods in order to develop particular qualities. I found in my early days as a monk, for example, I was just doing mindfulness of breathing, and I found that my mind over some time became very dry, barren, sterile. So then I found it valuable to supplement the practice of anapana or mindfulness of breathing with adding two other approaches to meditation. One is the Buddhanussati, the recollection of the qualities of the Buddha. And so in the Pali tradition, we have 9 epithets or designations of the Buddha. And that helps to inspire faith and devotion, dedication. And then the other supplementary meditation that I found useful was to add periods of metta bhavana, the loving kindness meditation. And so throughout my life as a monk, I've used these 3 methods as well as pure insight meditation.
Yeah.
Okay, but so that, because all comes within a single tradition where I think there might be some maybe drawback or danger. Well, I think people have to first explore maybe different systems and methods of practice, different schools of Buddhism, to find the particular school or system that resonates with them, the school to which they, method of practice for which they have an affinity. But once they choose a particular system within which to practice, then they should stay consistently with that practice. The danger is in people just jumping from one system to another, like maybe starting off doing like Vipassana insight meditation, then maybe they'll think, maybe I should try Zen meditation. And so then they try maybe Soto Zen or Rinzai Zen. Then that gets a little dry. Then they look over and see, oh, the Tibetans have the visualization meditations, the mantra meditation, and then you jump over there. So maybe at the beginning you could experiment with different systems to find what is the system within which I feel comfortable. But once you determine that this is a system I want to follow, then one should stay within that system. Even though I think within that system there might be different methods of practice. And so one could experiment with the different methods within that system, but you should adhere firmly to the system that one chooses as one's vehicle of practice.
Thank you, Venerable. Yeah, that sounds like it just reminds me so much of the Buddha himself, how he went on and practiced so many different ways. And then one day, if I remember correctly, recollected when he was a young
Yeah,
boy
yeah,
and sitting under the Bodhi tree and entering upon the first jhana.
yeah.
And I wonder, a lot of time people, when they read that, they feel like, oh, well, we are normal people. We cannot enter upon the jhanas immediately, or when we practice to do so. And a lot of people then they get attached to the siddhis that arise,
Hmm.
right? Or the idea of it.
Yeah,
And
well, the cities or the idis depend, generally, they depend upon the mastery over the jhanas.
yeah,
Though I think there's a danger in making the achievement of siddhis or iddhis the motivation for one's practice. And so the Buddha, he does include the iddhis as sort of the marks of at least certain types of fully accomplished practitioners. So he doesn't completely discourage them as sort of like the mark of a true like master of meditation is that they have I think there are 8 different iddhis that are mentioned in the stock formula in the suttas, but it would be a danger to make the achievement of the iddhis the motivation for one's practice, because the iddhis are a kind of expression of power. And if one is pursuing these iddhis with a mind which is centered around the egocentric motivations, the sense of self and desire to gain power, more power for the self, so that even that one can control natural phenomena, um, then it can just lock one even further into egocentric ways of thinking. Like the classic example of this is the Buddha's disciple Devadatta, who apparently mastered the jhanas, and then based on the jhanas, he attained the iddhis, but he had a ambitious, he was motivated by strong ambition to become powerful leader of the Sangha. And so he tried to overthrow the Buddha and take control of the Sangha for himself. And as we know, the end result was that he collapsed, and according to the text, he was reborn in the hell realms.
yeah, yeah. And can you, Venerable, just share with us a little bit about, so people, they can keep the precepts, but then we have like the Kusala Dhamma and we have the Brahma Viharas. And can you, just for people, kind of distinguish these points of why all of this is important for ethical conduct, why all of this is important for us to have a sustainable practice, to not fall into these traps?
Hmm. Okay, so you mentioned the Kusala Dhammas,
Yeah,
the precepts, and the Brahma Viharas.
yes.
Okay, so kusala is a very, very broad term. Kusala is, I translate it as wholesome. So this includes like all good qualities, whether it's good qualities. In fact, the 5 aspects of training that I just mentioned can be considered collectively as kusala dhammas. That is faith and devotion, ethical conduct, generosity, study or learning, and wisdom. And then we have the text mentioned 10 courses of wholesome karma, which is abstaining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. That's 3 of the body, and 4 of speech, abstaining from lying, slanderous speech, harsh speech, and gossip. And then 3 of the mind, avoiding excessive longing or craving, avoiding ill will, and holding right view rather than wrong view. So those are the 10 ways of wholesome action. And those include the first 7 of those are types of sila, of ethical conduct. But then beyond the ethical conduct, one also has to develop, we call a wholesome frame of mind or state of mind, and some of the sort of beautiful qualities that contribute to that wholesome or noble state of mind are what they call the Brahma Viharas. That is loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. So when the mind is suffused with those beautiful qualities, then it becomes spacious, open, receptive, and those qualities make the mind conducive to samadhi or concentration.
Thank you, Venerable. And I know in our last interview, you kind of touched base upon this, but I'm curious, in today's world, I mean, it's so also effused with chaos and a lot of disruptive, kind of unwholesome ways of being in the general population. I know I'm stereotyping here, but just generalizing, right? Like there's a lot of worry, there's a lot of angst. And how do you personally maintain loving kindness and compassion toward the world? And I will go as far as equanimity as well. When you're seeing all that's happening.
I think for me, the natural response to all of the types of suffering that we see in the world is for the mind of loving kindness and compassion to arise. Yes, but I say that compassion is a very, very difficult quality to maintain because to develop compassion, one has to look at suffering, and it's very, very difficult to maintain the focus on suffering. So I find it maybe desirable at the outset to develop the mind of loving kindness. So that is developing the benevolent wishes, just wishing for people to be well and happy. And then one can look at people in situations of suffering and not dwell too much on the suffering, but just bring them to mind in a very broad and general way, and then just generate the wish, may all the people in this place, in this situation, may they be well, happy, and safe. And then when we look at the suffering in the world, as I said, when we're trying to generate compassion, there's a tendency for that to pull the mind down. And so I find it's very important to balance the development of compassion with the development of mudita or altruistic joy. And so the way I've done this practice, I've developed a kind of systematic way of doing it. And one brings to mind first our historical Buddha, the Buddha Gautama, and then rejoices in his attainment of Buddhahood. Then one brings to mind the Buddhas of the 10 directions or the Buddhas of the past and rejoices in their Buddha activities. And then one could bring to mind the great bodhisattvas like Manjushri, Samantabhadra, Avalokiteshvara, and rejoice of Maitreya, the future Buddha, rejoicing in all of their virtuous qualities, bringing to mind the great disciples of the Buddha like Sariputta, Moggallana, Ananda, rejoicing in their qualities, and then imagining these streams of Buddha's practitioners and all virtuous practitioners of any faith tradition through the centuries, right up to the present, and rejoicing in their virtues. And that helps to uplift the mind so that one can then turn back to the suffering of the world and generate a strong compassion without being pulled down by that suffering.
And Venerable, how do you personally work with the feeling of maybe if it arises for you, I'm not sure, I don't want to make an assumption, but the feeling of maybe hopelessness, or when the Venerables at your temple, if they ever express this hopelessness, like they want to help so much and they don't know how to help. I have found a lot of people have come to me recently and they have said, okay, I'm trying to do all these practices and I don't really understand how is it going to help the greater world.
Yeah, I think one has to find the particular channel through which one can express one's concern, one's compassion. There are many different channels through which one can do that. And one has to find, one can't do everything unless one is a fully accomplished Buddha, maybe. So we have to start with little steps. And so what I say is to find some particular cause, some where one feels that one could help, maybe some worthy organization or charity to which one can make regular contributions. Um, yeah, so if I could do a little advertisement for myself. So I
Yeah.
established some years ago with some of my students and friends, we established an organization called Buddhist Global Relief. And we took as our specific mission to address the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition faced by many poor communities around the world. We started off when we founded Buddhist Global Relief, we thought we were going to solve all the problems of the world. So we had the mission of helping people throughout the world who are affected by social and economic catastrophes, natural disasters, and so on. But it was just too ambitious. And so then we had to find a very specific mission. And so we took addressing the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition. And from there, we could broaden out because there are some underlying causes of hunger and malnutrition, primarily poverty. And then one of the sustaining factors of poverty is the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional cultures. And so a way to overcome poverty is, or at least to ameliorate poverty, is to support women and girls. And when we support women and girls, that also helps to alleviate hunger and malnutrition. And so we not only provide direct food aid to people, to communities that are suffering from hunger and malnutrition, but we also support the education of girls and support women who are so that they can start livelihood projects to earn more to support their families.
I love
And
that.
so, just in a general way, once one finds some cause to which one could devote one's effort and make donations and contribute in whatever way, then one will find in the midst of hopelessness, a sense of hope starts to arise, a sense of purpose and dedication. So even though things outwardly might look very dark and bleak, but at least you have a little guiding light in the darkness
Yeah.
to direct one.
Yes, Venerable. If people who are listening to this want to get involved in your organization, are they able to?
Well, we already have a staff, and so we don't really have that much opportunity for people like to become volunteers. But if people want to make contributions or to learn about the organization, they can go to the website of Buddhist Global Relief.
Okay, thank you, Venerable. And I'll put that link right
Yeah.
below as well. Venerable, I'm curious, how have you maintained a beginner's mind all this time throughout your practice and throughout your life, and maybe even the some of the venerables as they get older? Uh,
Yeah.
how do you guide them to maintain that?
Yeah, I think the expression beginner's mind maybe was coined by the Japanese Soto Zen master in San Francisco, Shunryo Suzuki, I believe his name was.
Yeah,
And what he meant by that is having, let's say, the beginner's mind is contrasted with the mind of the expert. The mind of the expert is a kind of presumptuous mind or an arrogant mind, the mind that thinks that one is a master, an expert, that one has already fulfilled whatever one has to do. And it leads to a kind of arrogance and presumptuousness. So the beginner's mind, I think what he means by this is a humble mind, a mind which is open, receptive, and yeah, not presumptuous, not pretentious, not arrogant.
so when people around you, when those around you have the quality of kind of, oh, I already know this, arise.
Mm,
Or
mm,
a lot of time, uh, like the foundational teachings, like the Four Noble Truths and the teachings you've mentioned, Venerable, people are like, oh, I've heard this before. I don't need to hear this again. But I don't know. I feel like that's where everything is, right? That's like where all the
mm.
higher teachings are.
Yeah, of course. If people hear teachings repeatedly, they might get a little bored with them, which is why I think it's there's a tendency amongst Dharma teachers always to be having like new versions of the teaching, as though we could always have to refashion the teachings in order to make it attractive and to overcome this um, the tendency of the teachings to become worn out and boring and monotonous and tedious.
Venerable, as like a renunciate, have you found it difficult to explain to people like the importance of the ordained Sangha? And I'm just wondering if there's any way that today you can just share to people why the ordained Sangha is important, why it should not be eliminated, why the teachings are still so fruitful and so alive that that sometimes it does need to be delivered by the ordained Sangha, not just a book or a person who has taken like a mindfulness training for 3 years, for example.
Yeah, this is a very important question because there's a tendency now in contemporary Buddhism to regard the monastic order as being almost a kind of antique, archaic institution, which is no longer relevant. And I know that many lay people find it easier to connect with and to relate to lay teachers rather than to monastics, because the monastic way of life is quite different from the way of life of a lay person. But I think we always have to remember that the eventual aim of Dhamma practice is liberation, moving out from the cycle of repeated birth and death. And so we have the monastic Sangha as a kind of visible representation in this world of the ideal, which is the transcendence of the world, liberation from the world. And so the Buddha himself, when he set out on his Arya Pariyesana, his noble quest, his quest for liberation, he didn't retain his status as a prince, but he gave up the princely status and adopted the mode of life of a samana, of a renunciant. And then he established the monastic order to provide the opportunity for those who wanted to completely dedicate themselves to following his path of training, to embrace that path of training by becoming renunciants, samanas themselves. And so the path, when you reach the higher stages, it requires, or even intermediate stages, it requires the restraint of the senses, being able to live in simplicity, contentment, to make one's life dependent upon others, in that one is not providing for oneself, one is not establishing one's own resources. Um, and the ideal is the life of what's called a kinchana, the person without any possessions, the person who completely renounces even their own identity as an individual. And so in the household life, when there's always has to be establishing some kind of personal identity, even if one is a Buddhist practitioner. But when one goes into the homeless life, ideally one should be striving to sort of strip away all of the claims to individual identity. Even our appearance, we all have pretty much the same appearance. Though in different traditions, the colors of the robes are somewhat different, but we all wear the same kind of robe. We shave our heads. And sort of the ideal is that we all blend together so totally that it's almost impossible to single out monastics as individuals. All of them are just in a way, individualized reflections of the Buddha himself.
Yeah. I love that. I remember when I was very young, and it was before I was ordained, I would go to a temple and I would bow to the same person over and over and over again, thinking they're a different person because there were many, many monastics around.
So you went to temples when you were very young?
When I was young, yeah, I asked my parents if I can explore different spiritualities and try to
Yeah,
find my way in the
yeah,
world. And my parents are both have Christian side and a Jewish side. They said, "Go explore," and
I see.
everything always led me to the Buddhist path. And
At what age was this?
it started at 8 years old.
8 years old.
That's when it started exploring and figuring
Mm.
out.
And you
Uh,
found the Buddhist path at how old were you?
or consciously or unconsciously. Unconsciously, probably 15. Unconsciously, 6 years old when my dad got a little Buddha. And he
Mm.
said, don't play with it. So he went to work, and I was a naughty 6 year old. So I took it
Yeah.
and I started playing with it. And this
Mm.
little Buddha was the teacher of very big
Mm.
stuffed animals.
It was the teacher. What was that?
It was the teacher of these very big stuffed animals.
Oh, stuffed animals. I see.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
so
that
you
was
must
that.
have deep karmic affinities with the Buddhist path.
I think so.
Yeah.
I wonder, Venerable, how do people really put down the ego, though? I mean, this egoic structure of them that I feel takes over the mind, right? But
Yeah, that first, like the sense of ego, it's so deeply ingrained in the mind. So within the s- canonical teaching of the Buddha, so the Buddha speaks about different fetters, and one of those fetters is called asmi mana, which is the conceit I am, the clinging to the idea that there is some kind of inner I, ego, or self. And that particular fetter is eliminated only at the highest stage of realization, the stage of arhatship. But the idea of I am sort of bends down at lower levels and becomes expressed in the view of a self. That is the belief that there is some real substantial personal basis for personal identity. And that view of self manifests in other related unwholesome states: pride, arrogance, despising others, the need for praise, honor, fame, personal distinctions. And so what I found to be maybe the most direct, powerful antidote to this clinging to the idea of self is to use a contemplation that's often recommended in the suttas, and just to view oneself in terms of the five khandha or skandha, the five aggregates, and just mentally go through each of the aggregates. One doesn't need to develop deep insight to do this practice. One just goes through each of the aggregates using the reflection, this is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. So one goes through first the physical body, not mine, not I, not myself. Then one goes through the feelings, then perceptions, or including ideas, one's thoughts, not mine, not I, not myself. Then one's projects, one's intentions, one's motivations, not mine, not I, not myself. And then one takes the aggregate of consciousness, which is the subtlest and deepest of the five aggregates, and contemplates even consciousness itself as being not mine, not I, not myself. And if one does this as a regular practice, it sort of gradually weakens, attenuates that sense of self.
can you tell us what's consciousness, Venerable?
Yeah, well, from the Buddhist standpoint, consciousness, I say, is just the light of awareness which sort of flows out through each of the six sense bases. And so we have the Buddha analyzes consciousness into the six types of consciousness. Eye consciousness, which is the awareness that arises through the eye and takes in as its object the field domain of visible objects. Ear consciousness is the awareness that arises based on the ear faculty and is cognizant of sounds. And so through smell consciousness, tongue consciousness, tactile consciousness through the body, and then mind consciousness, which takes mental objects. And probably the real troublemaker is the mind consciousness, because that is what formulates or what interprets the experience coming through the other senses in terms of the notion of I, mine, and myself.
Yeah, I have definitely found the mind be the biggest troublemaker in my life.
Yeah, yeah.
Venerable, is this why this kind of clinging to this notion of self, is this why people, when they're very sick, they become afraid, or when they're
Yeah.
reaching old age, they become afraid they're going to die soon, or they're on the deathbed and they have regrets?
Yeah.
Can you share a little how you view this old age, sickness, and death, and how one doesn't need to be afraid, how one doesn't need to have regrets?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm now 80 years old, so I'm in old. I think they would say that this is old age. And I do have a chronic health condition myself. It's a chronic head pain condition, which is often debilitating, so that I'm not able to, sometimes for a whole day or several days in a row, almost unable to function. And of course, at this age, at the age of 80, one doesn't know when death is going to strike. Over the past 2 years or so, several of my good friends have passed away who have been even younger than myself. So one of the maybe tools that the Buddha gives us to prepare us for old age, sickness, and death is to do a daily reflection, or at least a regular reflection. So he gives the theme that Jara dhammom hi jarang anatito, that I am subject to old age. I've not escaped from old age. I'm subject to illness. I've not gone beyond or escaped from illness. I'm subject to death. I've not escaped from death. And of the three, probably the one which is the most powerful and maybe the most scariest is the theme of death. And so a good practice to do occasionally, maybe not every day, but an occasional practice, is to do maranasati, which is the meditative contemplation of death. And so one brings this down to the point where one could even imagine or visualize oneself lying on one's deathbed, maybe surrounded by some of one's loved ones, either in a hospital or at home. And one imagines now death is coming. I'm about to die. And one trains oneself in being able to let go of one's attachment to all of one's possessions, let go of one's attachment to one's loved ones, and to let go of the attachment to this physical body. And so when one does this as a training, as a practice, it's sort of like rehearsing for the actual event itself, so that when that death takes place, whether it's a natural death, which can be expected, or a sudden death, which comes completely unexpected, when death arrives, one is able mindfully and peacefully to let go. It's a little bit like an actor who has a role in a play. So to be able to perform their role successfully, they have to rehearse and practice over and over. Then when they get up on stage, when the actual play is taking place, when the curtain opens, then they're able to recite their lines successfully. But if the actor thinks, no need for me to practice, when the play opens, I'm going to know my lines. I just take a quick look at them and I'll know them. Then they get up on stage, the curtain opens, and then they get overcome by stage fright and they become a failure in their performance.
Yeah.
And so we have to be like actors who rehearse their role well so that they're able to execute it when the real play takes place.
I really love that you mention actors, Venerable, because shortly after I just ordained, my master said to me, I was very sad about something personal, and she says to me, if you see that life is just one big show, you will never have to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds very connected to me. Venerable, may I ask one final question?
Mm-hmm.
Would there be any piece of advice that you can give or suggestion to the monastic Sangha, to the venerable bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, for them on their path of practice and study?
I think the big problem that many, especially junior monastics, face as one matures sort of in the monastic life is that when one reaches a certain age, one starts to face maybe what would be called a midlife crisis, particularly when one reaches the 40s or 50s. One starts to think that this monastic life is tedious, boring, difficult, um, irrelevant in today's society. And then the sort of one glances out at people enjoying the household life, and one sees that there are also like serious lay practitioners who are able to lead lives dedicated to the Dhamma, but also to enter into romantic relationships and to take on careers in the world. And that starts to seem attractive. And that will, what I've witnessed myself over many years as a monk, seeing many, many monastics leave the monastic life either because they want to enter into a meaningful and fulfilling romantic relationship, or which is not necessarily just driven by sexual desire. In fact, when the person gets to be in their 40s or approaching 50, the sexual urge might be they have some control over that, but it's the need for a more fulfilling emotional relationship. And also the other urge, as I said, is to find some way to make a meaningful contribution in the world by taking up some kind of career. Maybe it can be as a psychotherapist, as a social worker, or maybe going as a teacher, a school teacher. And so that will pull the person out from the monastic life. And so what I found very useful for myself is always to look at this monastic life using the long-term perspective, looking at it from, I would call from the samsaric perspective, not just looking at it in terms of one single life, but in the multi-life perspective, and seeing that it's extremely, at least said it's in this quote in the suttas, it said extremely rare to encounter the Buddha's teaching, extremely rare to have the opportunity to hear the Saddhamma, the good Dhamma, and then it's extremely rare to pabbaja, the going forth into homeless life is very rare. And so this was really like a very, very precious opportunity, which is rarely encountered, in that one should make full use of this opportunity in order to, um, to progress along the path to liberation. And I think it's a big problem that I found that certain monastics face, or many monastics, is that they think that the only way to live a meaningful monastic life is to fully plunge into meditation. And maybe there are a few people who have strong karmic backgrounds, accumulated paramis, who can succeed in living an entirely meditative life, but large numbers, probably the great majority, don't have that underlying background of supporting conditions. And so if you think that the only way to lead a meaningful monastic life is through intensive meditation, maybe in the initial stages when we'll start to to undergo remarkable experiences, but then one reaches a certain plateau where things dry up and further progress becomes difficult. Then one becomes disappointed, discouraged, despondent, and becomes tempted to disrobe. And so what I would say, in addition to one's meditative practice, one also has to find meaningful ways, fulfilling ways to live within a monastic community. One has to be able to connect with other monastics in a community to establish a kalyana mita, to good friendship, and to find some activities through which one can develop personal talents and make a contribution to the monastic community. Some might become scholars, some administrators, some are skilled in even construction work, or skilled in giving talks, writing, and so forth. So one finds a particular talent that one has and tries to find fulfillment in the monastic life by exploring that talent.
Thank you, Venerable.
Okay, thank you.